There we go.
So welcome to our August 10th Lunch and Learn. We just have our basic rules here in the box. Just for a great experience for everyone, if everyone could mute themselves. And if you don't want to have your video on right now during the presentation, or you can, our speaker requested that people do keep it on so that she can see some faces. And then when we take the questions and answers at the end, we'll be able to unmute yourself at that point. But the background noise can be very distracting during the recording if people are, doing other things. My name is Stephanie Gotard, and I am the executive director of the Huntington Historical Society. And we wanted to thank our sponsor, M&T Bank, for sponsoring our Lunch and Learn series, our virtual as well as in-person series. And we also want to thank our members and everyone who has made a contribution to this Lunch and Learn today. Without our membership, we would be at a loss for all the support that they give for our programming and all the things that we're able to put on throughout the year. Today we have an expert in her field, internationally known textile historian, Rabbit Goody. She's going to revisit her 30 years of research in woven history, the technology and innovation of Long Island coverlets from the 1800s to 1860s. And she's going to discuss factors that influenced design on Long Island coverlets and what makes them special. She'll be re-examining how the similar motifs I've seen in Long Island coverlets for decades were highly influenced by Long Island's status as an island, in stark contrast to the rapidly evolving coverlet designs of other parts of New York State weavers and their customers' prized innovations over tradition. And today's Lunch and Learn, where we've been in coordination with Preservation of Long Island, we did a collaborative exhibit. We have our curator, Emily Werner, and the curator from Preservation Long Island, Lauren Brinkett, where we have our exhibits up until October, farm to fabric, early woven textiles of Long Island in our Soldier Sales Museum, and blanket statements, Long Island's early weaving history, over at our friends at Preservation Long Island gallery in Cold Spring Harbor. So it's been a time of coverlets and textiles, as I was telling Rabbit Goody when we got on before the Lunch and Learn began. Very exciting to have presentations by Lauren and Emily over the last couple of months, as well as weaving demonstrations in our arsenal on our historic loom. And we will have another one coming up this weekend on Sunday. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our expert and stop sharing my screen.
Okay, and I hope everyone can see me well enough. I don't know what view you need, but and I actually have two things going so that we can actually look at some coverlets. Well, thank you very much. The definition of an expert is somebody who's 50 miles away from where you're speaking and has a PowerPoint presentation. So I have neither a PowerPoint presentation and I don't actually consider myself an expert. I consider myself somebody who's very involved in trying to understand textiles within material culture, but also in terms of the technology. And the question I constantly ask myself is, how did this come into being? What were the factors that allowed this particular coverlet or blanket or dress fabric or upholstery fabric to come into being? Who's weaving it? How do the designs get passed from one person to another? What's the training involved? What's the technology? What do the looms look like? Those are the questions that I ask myself about every piece of textile that I get to look at. I just happen to be fascinated by bed coverings because they represent such an amazing breadth of design and competence and technology for both home vernacular weavers and for the trained fancy weaver. So what I'm going to share with you today, I hope, is the fact that I know less than I did 30 years ago. And the more research I do, the less I'm willing to say I actually know. But I did through, well, it was SPLEA then, but it's now Preservation Long Island. I did manage to do an exhibit, which we called Woven History, a name that I have now taken to be part of my business, and tried to do a pretty in-depth survey of extant coverlets for Long Island, because Long Island has some really special, well, it's an island, darn it. And being an island, we can really look at when certain ideas and certain technologies come into being, and then how quickly they either transition into the larger population, the mainland, or how soon Long Island gets backwatered. And the fact that Long Island gets backwatered as early as the Revolution means that to some degree it creates for us this perfect petri dish of trying to understand how innovation happens in the weaving of coverlets. Long Island has a vast collection of coverlets, but they only fall into a very few categories. And so it was pretty easy once we started doing an inventory to say, yeah, there's something going on here and it's really exciting, and then it really gets stuck and the rest of the world continues on. The innovation tends to then go up the Hudson Valley, across the Mohawk Valley, and progress westward, which of course is true of whether it's agricultural technology or textile technology or foodways technology. It follows that same path of migration. And it's just that we have this wonderful little microcosm of Long Island to study. And what else is neat about Long Island is, for some reason, it's incredibly conservative of its material culture. So we literally have 17th century artifacts that survive well on Long Island. The Hortons marry the Wells marry the Hortons, the Wellesley marries these. It's a finite population for a long period of time, the period of time we're studying, and people tend to hold on to their material culture. So if you go out to Shelter Island, you're bound to find things that were produced in the 17th century. We have the earliest flag that we can date from Long Island. We have some very early textiles, and that's a treat. And there's no other place that I can say, yes, it happened here on Long Island and it stayed here on Long Island, and we can study it in its context. It didn't move. And that, for me as a researcher, is thrilling, but also just adds to everybody's data about that. And strangely enough, from the time that Woven History became both an exhibit and also a published inventory, I have been continually adding and adding. So my copy is just full of incredible annotations. But I want to talk first about the mots and the mott mill, because of all of the innovative textile design, the mots do something that is spectacularly different than anybody else, and they do it earlier than anybody else. So one of our earliest coverlet forms on Long Island is this form right here. And I don't know if I hold this up some, and I think any of you who have looked at Long Island textiles might, in fact, we're doing this in my office because the mill is just too noisy to do anything in most of the time. What's spectacularly interesting about this form of coverlet is that in the early 1800s, this is new. Not the weave structure, not necessarily the motifs, but the mots do something that hadn't been done anyplace else, which is they put in a name and a date. And I think I have to do it this way. Can everybody maybe see the R Oakley in this? I'm doing a very bad job of holding it up, but
Yes, you are.
what? Can anybody see that? Does it make any sense?
No.
Yes.
Yes, no?
Yes, I can see it.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, so the ability to weave in a name and a date does two things for us. One, it totally locates that material object in time and space and personalize it. So the name on coverlets is the recipient generally, not the weaver, and especially if it's a woman's name. Women did not weave these coverlets. They may have done the spinning on the coverlets, but they did not do the weaving on these coverlets. And just backtracking, I want to be very clear. Itinerancy in weaving is not an American theme. Itinerancy in painting, maybe. But weavers who are weaving fancy work are trained weavers with equipment that doesn't allow them to be itinerant. They're certainly not going to come and weave in my house in 1790 on my loom, because my loom doesn't have enough equipment, enough technical equipment to be able to produce the kind of work that they are used to producing. It'd be like having the chef of the Waldorf Astoria try and cook in my kitchen. It doesn't happen. Women did a lot of weaving. Long Island has a huge textile tradition of spinning cotton as early as the 1640s. It has a tradition of wool worsted combing. It has a tradition of flax growing. It has a tradition of hemp growing. But the kinds of things that were produced in homes were the kinds of things that are utilitarian objects that can be done using simple looms to create plain weave, twill weave. So simple blankets, toweling, tablecloths, some amount of bedding, textiles, generally undergarments, but not everyday clothing fabrics, with the exception maybe of one or two. But the fancy weaver was a man whose trade it was to weave fancy goods. The Motts, who were Quakers, did something that was really different and new. And we rarely get to actually track that. That's what makes this so incredibly important on Long Island, is we have thousands of fancy weavers in the United States. And New York State, I think I have maybe 3,000 weavers, fancy men who are doing this as a trade. But we are never able to always identify where something really begins, where an idea really becomes different. And the Motts are a point in time that's so special. They were able to weave an initial and a name into one panel of the coverlet. And then they're able also to put a date into that coverlet. I don't know why this is doing something stupid. But anyhow, so the ability to put a initial, in this case, R. Oakley, on one panel of the coverlet, and to put a date into the other panel of the coverlet is really a truly unique thing. And I don't know if you can see that, but it says February 2nd, 1828. this is early on the coverlet continuum. So the first named and dated coverlet that we have is 1810 and done in this style, and it's attributed to the Motts themselves. We know that they were Quakers, and we know that when they were weaving coverlets for other Quakers, they didn't use Roman dates. They used first month, second month, third month, fourth month. And we even have, I believe, a tablecloth surviving that they wove, because they did more than coverlets, for, I think, Rebecca Seaman, I'm going to say, that has certainly the numerical dating of first month, second month, third month. So we know when they were dealing with their Quaker clients, they used Quaker dating and biblical dating, and they didn't use Roman dating. So why is this even remotely important to us? Because we have to understand what the status of a coverlet is in the 18th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century. You and I may decide to either put a bumper sticker on our car, or we may decide to freshen up our kitchen and show off our kitchen to our neighbors, or maybe a bathroom. But you and I would never particularly remodel our bedroom and use that as a place to show status. But 18th century, your bed, your best bed in the house, is how you show your wealth. And it's in a prominent place in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century. It's usually downstairs. It may even be in the parlor. And it's a place where you actually entertain. It's not a place that's hidden away, and your best textiles are your bed hangings, your bed covering, and possibly your parlor carpet. And that's how you show your wealth. So these coverlets represent so much more than innovative technology. They represent, to a great degree, people's ability to show off wealth. And relatively, even if you were participating in the making of the coverlet by doing the spinning of the wool and possibly the spinning of the cotton or the twisting of the cotton, then in fact, you still had to pay the weaver. And you're paying the weaver either in goods or services in kind or in cash. But nonetheless, you're spending money to acquire something fancier than you can weave yourself in your home. And that raises the status of the coverlet and puts it into material, a context that we can understand as being status. So the Motts, in their ability to put names and dates into coverlets, are the first to really say this is claiming. Not only is it status because it's a coverlet and you've spent money on it, but now it is personalized and it is dated. So the earliest one is 1810. We see them work through the early 1830s, and they start doing other things besides putting names in. They start putting pattern names in. So you'll see a name like Blazing Star actually written into the coverlet. So now not only are we putting a person's initials and last name in, not only are we putting a date in, but we're actually claiming a pattern design. And that, again, adds to the status, but also helps us understand that there must be enough competition going on Long Island that we're going to have to do this. So what supports this kind of development? And the newspapers of the time do a great deal for us in terms of reading weavers' advertisements. And the advertisements tell us what these weavers are doing, where they're located, what you as the client needs to bring to the weaver. Remember, a trained weaver is not doing the spinning. He may at times be acquiring some of the yarn, but it's your responsibility to actually provide the yarn that he's going to use to make your coverlet. This dovetailing of trades and of ability is why the weaver is settling in a rural area anyhow. And we are talking exclusively about rural areas, the kinds of coverlets that were woven, that were spun at home, the yarn taken to the weaver, and then the weaver weaves the coverlet, you get it back. You might do the center seam. Many of these are seamed in the center. This dovetailing only happens in a rural area. It only happens where people are already spinning and weaving. It's not happening in Newport. It's not happening in Manhattan. It's not happening in Boston. It only happens where spinning and weaving is already going on. These weavers settle in an area where they can make a living. And in essence, we're talking about a service industry. The Motts also produced carpet. And people always go, carpet? Did they have carpet in the 17th, 18th, 19th century? Actually, they had more carpet than we have today because floorboards are harder to replace. When you think about what's important about living in rural Long Island in the 1790s to 1828, like Rebecca Oakley did, you have to understand that without central heat, with softwood floorboards, carpeting is as important as bed covering, and covering is covering. So wall covering, we do see it, bed covering, coverlets, and floor covering, we see almost everywhere. It's not an uncommon thing at all. So how is that done? Well, the patterns for floor covering and the pattern for coverlets are not so dissimilar. And carpet is woven in narrow strips about a yard wide, give or take, sewn together and then laid down wall to wall. So we often see tack holes around the perimeter of a room when we're looking at old houses, and wool carpeting was tacked down wall to wall. Often it was taken up in the summer, grass matting was put down. Sometimes the grass matting stayed down and the wool carpet was reinstalled on top of it. But carpeting and coverlets go hand in hand. And that's an important part, again, of the material culture. So when the weavers were advertising what it was they did or could do for you, carpet is always the first. And carpet coverlets, meaning something that looks like this blue and white coverlet, comes second in their advertisements. Some of the weavers even announced that they could put your name and the date and sometimes even the place name into the corner of the coverlet. I want to just bring up one more, well, actually I have two more Long Island coverlets. We talked a little bit about the design of Long Island coverlets, and this design becomes one of the most important recurring center, and I'm going to see if I can show it maybe from a different angle. The center design in this coverlet begins again in the late 1820s, early 1830s. And this is early for coverlets, no matter where we're talking about. The problem with it on Long Island is it doesn't change very much. There are a couple of questions that come into play when I say that, even, to me, and I've been working with this for a long time. Why not? If patterns were easy to change, if it costs very little money or capital or knowledge to be able to change the center motif pattern, would it have been done? The competition was pretty stiff. But again, Long Island gets backwatered very early. So the question is, where is there access to either the newer technology, or where is the access to different pattern motifs? But this one which unfortunately, and I have to say this, I've worked with this way too often. I'm gonna turn this.
Those type of wings, it doesn't say you into your shape any sense. Sure does. That's why Popeyes, those type of wings are more flavorful than fine, because they're not. I do taste that food too. Not over it. It makes sense. We mentioned that.
Catch a game last night, Mike?
Someone needs to mute themselves. Something is,
I couldn't believe it. They needed someone tough like you. That's the truth.
all right, let me mute them all.
Mike. So
This particular pattern, which shows up with
seriously, it's your call 844.
Except for about 1 minute, Robbie, I asked to unmute. She's not gonna.
I don't think she can tell that. I
I
don't
know,
think
I know
she
she
knows
doesn't
she's
know
muted.
that. I know. I just wanted to get that to stop. I've said ask to unmute.
I just unmuted me.
Yes, because there was a problem with somebody, so with that background. Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, no, that's why we love this.
A little blip in the technology.
So, the corner block, this wonderful starburst corner block, becomes identifiable as part of Long Island genre. But so does the center motif. And unfortunately, I've looked at it enough that all I see now is this dancing angel form, and I can't see it differently, but it is just flowers. But the question comes, why? Why don't we see a lot of change in Long Island coverlets? Sort of the later part of the genre, the 1858, 1860 versions of these coverlets still maintains and holds on to these same patterns. If it was easy to change, if it didn't cost a lot of money or change in knowledge, would it have been different? Would we see a larger variety of patterns? We certainly see those patterns up the Hudson, across the Mohawk, Western Pennsylvania, Western New York, Ohio, Indiana. Same period of time, and yet we don't see much change on Long Island coverlets. Is it solely because Long Island is backwatered? I don't think so. I think if the technology was easy to change and there's this much competition, I suspect these coverlets would have changed, but I suspect it has something to do with the ability to change the technology, to make changes in the pattern easily and at a low cost. Also, people were obviously still buying them. People were obviously still happy. And that speaks to how conservative the tastes on Long Island were all through the first part of the 19th century. So you have so many things that go into why patterns change, how difficult the technology is to learn, how I interface with that technology, where I'm going to get new patterns. Many of the weavers who wove these coverlets did not do the designing themselves. And that's the difference between the Motts, who actually were able to create some designs, and some of the weavers who are weaving this particular coverlet style. There are several different borders to these, but the center motif remains remarkably standardized. Where are they getting their patterns? Once they have patterns, why are they not changing them? These are the questions that 30 years later, I think I'm still just as lost as I was 30 years ago. I think I have a better idea of how the technology does or doesn't diffuse through a population, because I've been able to see what happens going up the Hudson Valley, through the Mohawk Valley, and traveling west. And as people migrate west they don't use old technology. They tend to be the innovators of the newest technology. We see that in agricultural implements. Nobody who moves to Western New York is still using a scythe to cut and a grain cradle to cut grain. They're using the newest technology. If you're moving further west, you're already someone who is innovative, somebody who is pushing quite literally the boundaries. And what you have is people who invest in the newest technologies, not conservative technologies. People who stay in one place tend to be more conservative of the technology they have. And we can follow that in agriculture. And I maintain that we follow that same idea when it comes to textile technology as well. And that's why when we think in today's world, when the textile industry moved out of the United States and moved to India and then to Indonesia and then to China, we don't see companies in China using technology that was old in America. We see them using the absolutely newest, brand newest, fastest, best technology in China, not old technology. You know, the thought that we take our looms and send them to India is just apocryphal. It doesn't happen. So I'm thinking that that's a pattern that is ancient, that as people move, they use the newest technology, not the oldest technology. So I want to share one more coverlet with you. This is the anomaly that the Port Jefferson Historical Society has one of these coverlets. And this is the transitional coverlet. Let's see if I can hold it up well. This is a transitional coverlet between figured weaving, the fancy stuff, and the geometric weaving that the mots are doing. And again, where else except on Long Island can we actually find that transition? So for me, in understanding the changes in technology, this one coverlet and the one coverlet that the Port Jefferson Historical Society has in their collection, to me is like finding the keystone. It's finding that one little kick that says, here is a weaver who is experimenting and going from a very geometric way of doing business to one who is doing something that is figurative. And the figurative looms, the mechanical attachments that allow us to do lions and tigers and bears, oh my, are just coming in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And you'll notice that I'm going to call the coverlets, like the one with the grape leaves, I'm going to call them figured coverlets or fancy coverlets. But I'm not going to call them jacquard coverlets, because the jacquard attachment is quite literally not in use for these coverlets. There are many other technologies that are in use for these coverlets. The ingrain carpet loom, for one. And remember, I mentioned these guys do carpet as well as doing carpet coverlets. That's what they call this stuff, carpet coverlets. And when I try to explain this to people, I use two expressions. If I ask you to hand me a Kleenex, you know instantly what you're supposed to hand me. You're supposed to hand me a facial tissue, right? But Kleenex is a brand name. And jacquard has become the Kleenex of the fancy weaving world. So anything that's figured today is called a jacquard coverlet. If I say to you, go Xerox something, you know immediately, I mean, put it on a copy machine and copy it for me, even though it's certainly not, in my world, certainly not a Xerox machine. So we have to be really careful when we talk about the word jacquard to not confuse that generic term that's come to mean anything that's figured with the technology that actually isn't being involved, because then we lose a whole lot of understanding about this coverlet, which is transitional between geometric and figured, and what was going on long before Joseph Marie Jacquard first patented his attachment, which he stole from everybody else who was already doing mechanical weaving. So mechanical weaving starts very early. It starts in the early 18th century with a guy named Falcon, who is French, who makes punch cards. And it's 100 years later that Joseph Marie Jacquard patents his attachment, and it's primarily for doing damask and brocade weaving in France, in Lyon. And he had no interest in making these things, and his head wasn't good for making these things. But the ingrained carpet loom, well, that had been going on for, again, many years, and for making carpet that looks just like this, except it's all in colors and it's all wool and not cotton and wool. So the weavers who were weaving these, advertising that they were also weaving carpet, were not using initially the jacquard attachment. We know they were using the ingrained carpet head, the barrel and cylinder loom. There were several other attachments. So I'm perfectly happy to say there's a difference between geometric work, figured work, and that's as far as I'm willing to go unless somebody shows me or tells me what attachment they're actually using. I want to read you just one weaver's advertisement from Long Island. And then I want to talk a little bit about carpet, because that's actually where I've spent much more of my last 30 years doing. The other thing that we really need to think about is just how much technology, how much imported cloth was being brought to Long Island at any given time. And for those of you who remember, I said that the Motts were also carpet weavers. It is so difficult to find any surviving ingrained carpet that was woven in America, and you're on Long Island have the 2 of 3 pieces that exist. One is this one, which is in the Nassau County Historical Collection, and that is from the Motts, and that's a geometric ingrain, and it's totally awesome that it exists at all. And then the other is from the Jones Mill in Cold Spring Harbor, and I've reproduced that one. It is the earliest dated American ingrained carpet, and you have it on Long Island. And there is nothing earlier. There is nothing more important to me as understanding where all this comes from as that particular piece of carpet. So the Jones Mill, we know who he was, we know where he was, we know what he produced, and we have one surviving repeat of that carpet. No other place in the United States can claim that. And what design is it? It's the same as a coverlet design. So it ties everything together in a way that no other piece of cloth in America does. I'm trying to read you. This, by the way, is, and I should have pulled a piece of the reproduction of it, but this is the carpet piece that exists in now Preservation Long Island's collection. And we've reproduced it in its original colorway, but Preservation Long Island at the time wanted it in blue and white. Don't ask me why, never mind. I didn't get into that. I'm not supposed to be political in any way, shape, or form. But I do want to read you the advertisement for let the public in general know that in addition to his other works, he has in operations looms for weaving carpet coverlets in the most approved plan, and having a workman of the first abilities from England, he would solicit the public patronage, having a number of patterns of the most approved fashion of those who may call and see can have their choice. They will be lettered with names and dates, etc., as may be directed. He continues to dye and weave carpet as usual. In addition to that, those who wish can have them wove ingrained or figured They will be made to order of any description and the material found. NB, he continues to manufacture cloth of any description and keeps cloth and coverlets on hand for sale or exchange. Common and merino wool wanted. That's one of also the earliest advertisements that we have that clearly states he's going to weave your name and a date into your coverlet and personalize it. He's not just weaving on speculation. He is a custom weaver. He's weaving your piece for you. And that connection ties us into understanding how rural systems work. Spinning and weaving has to be going on. We're able to take yarn, take it to a weaver, have it woven with our name and a date, and we can't do that ourselves at home, and we're willing to spend money on it, and it becomes part of the status of our household, and it gets passed down, and it becomes part of the legacy. I think I've rattled on enough. Why don't we see if we have some questions that we can get us into sort of further discussion about this. I could go on, for the next 20 years and bore you to death, but I'm passionate about understanding the relationship between different parts of the process and the work and the resulting cloth that allows us to see how technology gets developed, how different styles persist or don't persist, and how it fits into the larger material culture. Okay, I'll shut up.
And people can unmute themselves if they want to ask questions, or you can put your video on as well, so Rabbit could see your beautiful faces. And if you want to, you could also put anything in the chat if you would like that as well.
Question on the moths, where did they live?
Well, I'm not, good question. I know it's Nassau County. I know people know exactly where they lived, and we have their advertisements. We know where the Mott Mill, they called it a mill.
Manhasset, maybe?
I don't know, somebody who knows more about Long Island, his particular history, but you can look it up. I mean, people have documented it pretty well.
I think it was Westbury.
Yeah, it was Westbury, because one of their coverlets I think says Westbury, right? And yeah.
Robert,
Yes.
there's a question from Robin Horn. She said, "I'm curious how quality could be maintained when yarn was provided by the buyer."
That is a great question. Thanks. So first of all, spinning and weave, and I'm sure that the quality varied, and we do have some weavers remarking about, yes, I can only give you a good coverlet if you give me good yarn. Having looked at literally at this point thousands of coverlets, there is no consistency in quality. There's consistency in the weaving quality often, but not necessarily in the yarn quality. But, and I say this very sincerely, we're talking about people who have a tradition, who grow up doing these particular things like spinning as a daily thing from the time they're 5 years old to the time they practically can't move. And the quality of spinning that I see from the period is far superior to anything I see being spun by modern hand spinners as hobby spinners. There are very few modern spinners who can match what was done in the past. And when you look at these coverlets, it becomes pretty obvious that people who were doing this in the same way. There were good cooks and bad cooks, but most of them were okay cooks. So I think the quality is much better than you would expect if you're comparing it to modern hand spinning.
Oh, and Rabbit, there's another question from Robert Hughes. What is the significance of the date woven into the coverlet? Date that it was made, or a significant event such as a birthday or?
Good question. The only absolute reference that we can sort of find actually doesn't come from the Motts or Long Island, but comes from the day book of James Alexander, who started out in Connecticut, ended up in New Britain or Little Britain, New York State, up the Hudson, Newburgh area. And in his day book, he has names to be put in the corners for his coverlets. And there are 251 of them. He doesn't change the date very much. He changes, I mean, his dates are either September 4th, February 4th. I think he wasn't capable of changing very often. Date of making, I'm pretty sure, but he did. He wove one coverlet he wove 50 coverlets a year, so about one a week, and for 8 years. And doesn't change the date a whole heck of a lot. And I always sort of go, that's interesting. Again, if it was easy to change the date, not sure. But I don't think they're linked to a significant date of the client. I think they're located to the date just about that it was probably made. And I think we can be really sure about the year without necessarily being sure about the month and the day. Because I have a feeling, I have a feeling it's not easy to change. We see several for instance, we see several that are January, February. I don't think I've seen an August coverlet. Don't know. Don't have a good answer. Speculation, they're not significant to the owner. They're probably more significant to the weaver not being able to change it easily.
Are there any, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but are there any other questions from some of our curators, either Emily or Lauren? I know Emily got a chance to study with Rabbit Goody last spring. She went up for a workshop, and I see the two of them copiously taking notes as Miss Goody is speaking. So I don't know if they have any questions based on things that they've heard today or their experience with coverlets themselves.
What about the dye? Who dyes the wool?
So you have two choices. We know there were several dyers who worked on Long Island. Dyeing is a trade. It's hard to say it quite like that. Coloring wool and cloth is a trade. And just like the weaver, you could take yarn to the dyer, you could take clothing to the dyer to have it refreshed, you could take cloth to the dyer and have bolts of cloth dyed. But on the other hand, we do have plenty of receipts from weavers saying, if you're going to have me make a coverlet, bring me so many skeins of dyed yarn, so many skeins of blue, so many skeins of blue wool, so many skeins of cotton. We know women did some dyeing in the home, but they did not go gathering nuts and berries in the field. All they had to do was go to the store and buy dye woods and drugs. That's what they were called. Dyeing of yarn at home is possible in small quantities, but when you think you're going to dye hundreds of yards of cloth, no, not in the home. So for coverlets, we need probably 4 or 5 pounds of dyed wool. And yes, that is doable at home on skeins. And so you could provide your own dyed wool, or the weavers had an arrangement with a dyer and you brought your wool and you said, yes, I want blue or I want red. And he took it to the dyer and had an arrangement with the dyer. But dyeing is a trade. Dye stuffs are available in the store. Most of the blues we see are indigo, but there are some logwood blues, and there's a coverlet, and I don't know whose collection it's in. I'll have to look again because I've sort of forgotten, but there's a coverlet we had in the exhibit, which is blue and blue and blue, and there's 4 inches across one side, across one panel that's brown. And I can tell you that's logwood. And I can tell you that it lost its color. And I can tell you that the weaver had a basket of quills for his shuttle, and they all looked blue. And somebody mixed in a logwood blue one, and he wove it, and optically it was blue. And who knows when it turned? Logwood can be as fugitive as 3 weeks or last 100 years. But when I see one little stripe, and it's documented in woven history, so I can tell you where that coverlet resides. But there's one shuttle's worth, one quill's worth, it's brown. And there's no question in my mind that that's logwood, because that's what happens to logwood. The thing about organic dyes in general, indigo is a little bit of an exception, but the thing about organic dyes is they'll go away, they'll change color if they're not fixed properly with the right chemicals, that we call them mordants, but they don't bleed. They never visit their neighbors. It's hard enough to get those colors in there in the first place, and they don't go visiting. So when you see something that was white and now it's, and it had red stripes, and the red stripes have visited the white areas, you can be pretty much sure that that dye is post 1850. And that's sort of a good, it's not the best way or the only way, but it's a good way for us to start being able to put markers in and say, yeah, maybe I have to look at this piece a little more closely. Yes, Susan said that her great-great-grandmother spun and wove this in 1750, and you sort of have to say, well, maybe she's talking about 1850 and it's a different generation. So organics tend to fade, some, not as badly as modern dyes. They tend to change color if they're not stable, but, and here's the but, they don't visit their neighbors.
Rabbit, there was another question from Robin. How did you get involved in this line of study? Like how did you get started down this path?
Oh, brother. Well, firstly, I have to tell you that, you know, I am a weaver by trade, and that I started out as a hippie who wanted to grow my own food, build my own house, make my own clothing, which of course I've done and still do. Not my own clothing stuff, but the ability to reproduce historic textiles, the ability to look at any textile and take it apart forensically, sometimes physically, take it apart and be able to reproduce it is how I make my living. And if you guys want to have fun, go to YouTube and type in heavy metal weaving. And that's our, that'll show you how our mill runs and works and tells you a little bit about my philosophy of making. But I'm very interested in the transition between hand and powered technology, not just with weaving. Weaving is my fascination that way, but how do we get from hand process to mechanical and powered technology? And what are the compromises and changes that have to go on? I'll be honest with you. If I want to reproduce a piece of very fine linen from the 1490s, which is patterned and forms the canvas of an El Greco painting, by the way, you guys should look up a woman named Helena Lormans, because she's doing just amazing stuff. Painters in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century painted on figured linen canvases. They painted on what amounts to tablecloths of the time. And if I want to do that, and I really want to reproduce it, I'm better off using a timber frame loom from that period of time. I can't reproduce them on my looms and have it look the same. So we've lost something in that transition between hand and technology. And part of what I spend my time doing is trying to understand what the compromises are, what pieces of it I can embrace or not embrace. And as a hand weaver who started out reproducing historic textiles, I went to the industry to find the answers to problems, not to the revival weavers of the 1960s and 70s, because they had in fact lost almost all of the information that was crucial to making fixes and changes. It went to the industry. That's where the knowledge went, not to the hand weavers who sort of reinvent things dumbed down from the industry. So I'm unusual in that. But technology doesn't invent anything. That's the important thing. Technology invents nothing. A calculator didn't invent mathematics. The technology didn't invent weaving. It doesn't invent figured weaving. It takes what is going on and mechanizes it. And the question is, how good or how badly does it do that? And how close can we get to what the original was? And what did we lose? Did that answer that question?
I think it did. I think it was great. That was
Great.
Toby, you have a question?
No,
Oh,
I'll mute myself.
oh, I thought I heard you. I heard your voice.
You did. How do I mute myself? There it is.
Well, you don't have to mute yourself. Anything else anybody wants
Sure. Lauren put in the chat the YouTube, but I copied it as well. So when I send my note out to everyone, the two different things that were some of the things discussed, I can send out in an email to anyone for the link if they need it. Are there any other questions for doesn't like to be called as an expert, but based on what she said today, I would call her an expert. And a very informative discussion, presentation, Rabbit, on this topic. I mean, I think it's quite fascinating, all the things that you had to say today. And I feel that all of us here, learned a lot from you sharing your passion for coverlets and for this topic. If I don't know if there's Emily shaking her head in agreement to that, as well as Miss Lauren over there as well. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do this for us.
People are welcome to come visit the mill here anytime. And I am putting my collection on Catalog It. So it will be available. I have about 350 coverlets plus lots of other textiles, but also people are welcome to come and go through my coverlet collection at any point. I have it set up in a special, I have it set up not in the mill, in a place where you can actually look at things and pull them out and play with them.
And do you also, Rabbit, have any workshops coming up? If there's anyone on this Zoom call or the Zoom meeting, that if there's any workshops, if you could let me know or Emily know,
Sure.
or that we could share with the group, because there may be some people who are in your line of work and and would like to maybe work with you directly. I don't know if you were doing that or not at this point.
And yes, and I just finished a really great 3-day workshop at Eastfield Village, but my next workshop is September 23rd at Hyde Hall, and we're doing two things. We're doing a morning of reading weavers' drafts. In other words, how do we know what weavers were doing? Well, they left us recipes, and we need to be able to understand their shorthand and understand what they were weaving and what information we can glean from that. So that's September 23rd. And in the afternoon, we're doing a Bring a Textile show and tell, stump the chump, I like to call it. And it's amazing what's in private collections and what stories people have of how they inherited textiles from in their family, or just bought them at an antique store, and to try and discover what's out there and what we can learn from surviving textiles. I want to mention one other thing, because it's really on my mind. So, my field is an interesting one because it gets very little attention, because primarily women do the work in textile history today. And you have something on Long Island that's very special. The other place that I spend a lot of my research time is looking at 13-star flags. And you have the Holbert flag in collection, and the Holbert flag is truly an 18th century 13-star flag that has been discredited several times, and now is, I think, probably locked in a basement someplace. It is truly an original 13-star flag, and people need to know that it exists. And it's in terrible condition. It's been conserved a few times, but it is truly a treasure and needs a little bit more attention, because we get further and further away from looking at the precedent of what was available in terms of celebrating and naming and claiming our flag. Now, I'm not a flag person, I'm a textile historian. I can tell you why the Holbert flag is in such deteriorated condition. I can tell you that the star pattern is particularly interesting, and I refuse to get into the debate of whether it is real or not real. It is real. There is no question about it, and it's a shame that it got discredited. And seeing as I'm talking to people who are on Long Island, you ought to know about it. You ought to get it out of the basement.
It's at the Suffolk County Historical Society in Riverhead.
Absolutely. Yes. And yeah, some egos and personalities, I think, got involved in it, and that's unfortunate. And I spent a lot of my time looking at surviving 13-star flags, and there are quite a few of them.
Mm.
Just like there are lots of coverlets that survive. So anyhow, you have a treasure. You have lots of treasures on Long Island because it is an island.
So Rabbit, if they want to sign up for any of these workshops, are they listed anywhere in particular?
Site, on my website.
On your website? Okay,
This-
just so we know where to direct them. Okay.
Still no weavers.
I'll make sure that Emily, that I get that, and we put that in our email to everyone as well, so that if you would like to go to them. And
I send out newsletters, that say what classes I'm doing and so.
okay.
Yeah.
We'll make sure that this email list gets shared if they don't have it already, so that they can, see if they can make that. I'm going to just share our screen. We have also coming up, and just because we're in this textile world here, indigo dyeing. We're doing that on the 17th with one of our local artists. We're going to take the indigo plant, and she's going to show them how to dye it, and we're going to do some projects. We're doing a weaving, a basic weaving class. One of our intern, Evie Burke, who's grew up with weaving with her mom, and she's our scholarship Gardner Foundation Young Scholar Award this summer. She's doing some in-house weaving workshops, which we invited our friends from Preservation Long Island and Arts Council next door to come to. But we'll be doing a nighttime weaving with wine on the 24th, and we have our bigger events, our big fundraiser on the 14th, and then our social in September. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. I especially want to say thank you to our sponsor, M&T Bank. I want to thank Rabbit Goody again for making the time to do this lunch and learn with all of us, and for everyone who participated today.
Question that came over on the chat.
What happened?
There's one more question that came
Oh,
over
okay.
before we wrap up.
Okay. Let me just get out of this share. In the chat, Rabbit Goody talk a little bit more about the two-shaft wedge face coverlets mentioned in your book. Is that correct, Emily?
Yeah. Yes. Real quickly, they're actually more complicated than they look. And I don't believe, and now that I've woven a few of them, I don't believe they actually are two-shaft. I really think they are four-shaft. You can, for a lot of reasons, but they are early. We know that we have some very early ones from the early 18th century. Long Island, of course, has a few. I've collected a few. I've woven a few. They predate the geometric block coverlets, we think. But I'm beginning to think we don't really know how to date some of those styles. But we do know that most of the ones we find can be tied to the late 18th century, early 19th century. And they're not that easy to actually weave. And I think you're going to find when you actually plot them out that it's difficult to do them just on 2 shafts. So I don't
Thank
know
you.
who asked.
Thanks, Margaret, for that question. I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge the question from Margaret, who was the author of that question. Is there anything else? Because I don't want to squash anyone's enthusiasm for the topic, because we have time.
I have a very quick question, and hi, Rabbit, it's Hillary.
Hi. Ew.
The first figured weavings, I'm guessing China, but I don't know. How early, and are they draw looms?
Yeah, well, there's certainly some form of patterning. I actually think they're probably pickup for the very first ones before we even, in other words, again, technology doesn't invent anything. The draw loom is a technological advance. So the first, I'm sure, just finger manipulated. And when you think about the work that you do, a lot of that is just finger manipulation. So I'm roughly thinking I have some Peruvian figured work that's pre-Columbian, pre-contact, that's very old, and it's just finger manipulated. So my guess is not the draw loom. We see the draw loom in China as a technological advance, but it's a technological advance over what is already going. It doesn't invent figured weaving. And that's what people don't understand. If there's a technological advance, it's usually because something is already going on.
Bingo. As soon as you said that, I went to Backstrap Loom Americas. Yep.
Or, have a low technology and the ability to move threads, people move threads. And it doesn't matter. We even have needle weaving. Some of the first textile things are not woven, they're twined. And the ability to twine things and make designs in twined things, 30,000 years, 25,000 years ago. So people do color and pattern instantly. It's human. It's human to do that. People don't just make things plain. We don't make things plain unless that's not where we go. We go to decorating. We decorate walls and caves, for heaven's sakes. So why would you think we wouldn't decorate textile? I don't see any of us on these screens wearing something that has no color.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome.
All right. Well, if there is no other questions at this time, thank you again for attending, and look for other lunch and learns in person and virtual ones on all different kinds of topics. Trying to make sure that we have something for everyone's interests. Feel free to email me, director@huntingtonhistoricalsociety.org if you have any topics or things that you would like to hear more about, and we'll see as we plan, ahead, we can try to, accommodate people's interests. But thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye. This was great.
Bye.